I am frankly getting sick and tired of hearing this story that the concept postmodern neo-Marxism is an oxymoron. I hear it left and right, up and down. The concept, how dare you suggest that someone can be both a postmodernist and some form of Marxist. You see, there is a contradiction inherent, they say. Postmodernism rejects all meta-narratives. And what is Marxism and neo-Marxism but a grand meta-narrative? And so, we must reject. How can it possibly be the case that you can be both someone who rejects meta-narratives and believes in a meta-narrative? And I want to say at the outset, if that were the case, then the postmodernists, as soon as they made their fundamental realization that their whole task, their whole concept was that there is no justification for grand meta-narratives, they should simply have gone to the mountains and shut up forever. But instead of that, they continued to create their own meta-narratives. I mean, who is a prototypical postmodernist? Foucault. But what did Foucault do his entire career? He constructed meta-narratives. All of his books are a history of sexuality. He looks into the history of madness, the history of power. What can these be called but meta-narratives? Of course they're meta-narratives. Foucault wasn't so much of a Marxist in his meta-narratives. He was more clearly a postmodernist. But yes, the first thing we should realize is that the postmodernists did believe in meta-narratives and did construct their own meta-narratives. So as much as they thought that that's exactly what they were against, at the end of the day, if there is no truth, then why did you keep writing? What's the point? Because everything that you write is going to not be true if you don't believe that there's any truth. So Nietzsche, of course, thought there was no truth too. But he didn't think that the truth was the only value. He had a much broader concept of what we might do. And he realized that reason had its place. But if we're simply a group of philosophers who reject truth, who reject the possibility of a valid epistemology, then we ought not to say anything more. There are some philosophers who reject the possibility of a valid epistemology. They're called Taoists. And what they did was they went to the mountains and they shut up. And then they came back and they wrote a couple of poems so they could share their wisdom with the village. So let's just take a little journey through the thought process. So we start off with Marxism. Marxism is a grand meta-narrative of economies. How is it that history progresses? Dialectical materialism. History is a dialectic of material conditions. A certain material condition comes along. Eventually, its internal contradictions become so great that it is undermined, and a new set of conditions is proposed, and these contradict each other, and a new way has to be devised that does not have the contradictions inherent in the initial system. And this is Marx, and he thought, okay, we're going to move this forward, and eventually we're going to get to the utopia once all the contradictions can be ironed out. There is a place where all the contradictions are done, and that is called communism. Okay, so let's just say Marxism has a narrative. It's an economic narrative, historical economic narrative. Okay, let's look at postmodernism. As I said, Foucault constructs his own meta-narrative about power. So I'm going to try and make this as clear as possible. Marxism is a meta-narrative. Postmodernism is incredulity towards meta-narratives. So here we go. Postmodernists therefore must reject the Marxist, right? Well, of course, Foucault called himself a Maoist. This is very clearly a commitment to a meta-narrative position. Now, Neo-Marxism came after the failure of Marxism. Marxism failed. People tried to put it in place. It didn't really work. And of course, a new revamped Marxism was produced where instead of focusing on the economy, they focused on culture. And essentially what happened there was the economy and the Marxist narrative was replaced with the Foucaultian notion of power. And here we're seeing a fusion already between Marxism and postmodernism. Neo-Marxism essentially replaces the economic basis of the Marxist narrative with the power basis of the postmodernist narrative. So essentially what we have here is there is a narrative in this thing called postmodern neo-Marxism, where the postmodernists did believe in neo-Marxism, and there is a smuggled in meta-narrative, because we denied Marxism, we had postmodernism, where we said, okay, all meta-narratives are worthy of nothing but our incredulity. But we still have narratives, so we have to understand them, and how are they constructed? They are constructed by power, if we follow Foucault. So we ought to be incredulous towards meta-narratives, but at the same time we know that power is the root of the meta-narratives which we see. And so Foucault went about trying to deconstruct those. But of course he didn't recognize the fact that he himself was constructing his own meta-narratives. And therefore we are able to get to postmodern neo-Marxism, where a narrative has been smuggled in through postmodernism. Postmodernism, you might think, is the end of meta-narratives, but really all it is it's the end of other people's meta-narratives. The postmodernists themselves were perfectly happy to construct their own meta-narratives, and of course they were all French communists, so naturally the meta-narratives which they produced were neo-Marxist. And that's where we are today, with the neo-Marxist people, with the trained Marxists, you know. I mean, I'm not suggesting that every single person who believes this is beyond the pale, but it seems very clear to me that postmodern neo-Marxism, while on the surface seems like a contradiction, if you'd read or observed any of the actions and beliefs of the postmodernists, you'd realize that clearly it's something which is possible.